Okay, ladies and gentlemen, time for another episode of Reading the Constitution. And today's episode is about signing and ratification. It's Sunday, April 7th, 2019, and let's get started with this right now. So if you remember when we left off, we had gone through the entire original Constitution. We did the preamble, we did all the articles, we did the closing endorsement, the signatories, although we didn't look at who actually signed it, the attest. And we looked at every article, every section, every clause, every word. And so now at this point, you can imagine that the Constitution has been written, and what happens to it. So, well, anyway, let's take a look at that here. What we're going to do is just go through a timeline of what happens with the Constitution. So I'm going to start just at the very beginning, before it was signed in 1787. And I won't go through everything that happened, but in May of 1787, they decided, that's when they set a time for meeting for a convention to modify the old Articles of Confederation. They were supposed to make some minor changes to it. So, but anyway, they decided they were going to meet at this place called Independence Hall, and this is in Philadelphia. It's a very famous building. And in fact, you see this on a lot of pictures. I think it's on the $2 bill. And they ended up being there. And on May 25th, they finally had enough people to have a quorum. And a quorum, of course, means that there's enough people to have a meeting. And so they called it to order. The Constitutional Convention was called to order. And there were 55 delegates at the meeting from 12 states. And as you recall, Rhode Island didn't send any delegation. Well, anyway, they worked the entire summer. For the rest of May, all of June, all of July, all of August, beginning of September, it was a really hot summer, and they worked on this Constitution in Independence Hall. And by the way, they did it all. It was a lot of it was done in secrecy because they were supposed to be doing is just doing some minor changes to the Articles of Confederation, but they weren't supposed to be like rewriting an entire new Constitution. So they were very secretive about it. They kept all the windows shut, all the shutters closed and everything, because they didn't want any word leaking out. But anyway, by September 12th, they finally had got a final draft of the Constitution that was completed September 12th. So they handed it off to this guy named Jacob Chalice, who was a calligrapher, and they paid him $30. And on September 13 and 14, it took him 2 days, and he started writing this. This is the Constitution that everybody's familiar with the big tall letters that says "We the People," and the big letters say Article 1 and Article 2. So he wrote all of this stuff here. Here's the second and the third and fourth, and here's the last page here. And he wrote the whole thing, and it was unanimously approved by the state delegations. That'd be 12 state delegations, all approved it unanimously on September 15th. So that was it. The Constitution was officially approved. And then on September 17th, they all got together for a big signing. And this is a painting of it. You can see George Washington there at the top, and somebody signing it. And see Benjamin Franklin. You can see him sitting there in the front row. So this is all the delegates to the convention signing the Constitution on September 17th. So that's a very famous thing. And here's another thing you might be interested in. This is actually a logbook, the journal of the final vote on the Constitution. So that's pretty interesting. So anyway, that was September 17th. On September 18th, the Pennsylvania Packet, which I believe was a newspaper in Philadelphia, printed public copies. So they must have got a copy of it on the 17th. Or, they must have the original, because you can't get copies back then. So they had to typeset it. They must have worked all night long getting it typeset, and they printed public copies on September 18th. And the next thing that happened was George Washington took a copy of the Constitution, and he wrote this letter. It's called Letter of Transmittal, that he sent it off to Congress in New York with. And we already looked at this letter, and it basically said two things. One was that they should read it and then go and send it off to the states to have it ratified. And the second thing was, like, once it was ratified, they go off and form a new government and start operating a new government. So that's that letter, along with the Constitution, is sent to New York. It's received on September 20th by the Congress in New York City, and I guess it took about 2 days to get there. It probably went by horse-drawn carriage. And Congress read it, and then they voted on it. And on September 28th, they voted to send the proposed Constitution off to the 13 states. So they didn't waste much time. It was kind of like time was of the essence. From signing it, the 17th to September 28th, it was already going off to the states. And so the states all formed their conventions. I won't go into the details of that. But what happened was they started looking at ratifying it. And on December 7th, the very first state ratified the Constitution. It was Delaware, the first state, and there was 30-0, unanimous. A few days later, December 12th, Pennsylvania ratified it, 46-23. On December 18th, a few days later, New Jersey ratified it, 30-0. They were the third state. And that brings 1787 to a close. 1788 comes along. January 2nd, Georgia ratifies it. And it's 26-0 as a fourth state. And I remember that the number is to get to nine states, because Article 7, which we looked at, said that if 9 of 13 states ratify it, it becomes official. About a week later, January 9th, Connecticut ratified it, 128-40. They became the fifth state to ratify it. February 6th, Massachusetts ratified, 168, the sixth state. However, Massachusetts had a bunch of requests. They wanted a bunch of changes made to the Constitution. And remember, Article 5 gives a procedure to amend the Constitution. Okay, a couple of months later, April 28th, Maryland ratifies, 62-11, becomes the seventh state to ratify it. Just 2 more to go. May 28th, about a month later, South Carolina ratifies, 149-73, they're the eighth state. They also request 2 alterations. June 21st, New Hampshire ratifies, 57-47, ninth state. That is now 9 states ratified it on June 21st. Its Constitution is officially established. New Hampshire also requested 12 alterations. And June 25th, Virginia ratifies, 89-79, they're the 10th state. They requested 20 alterations. July 26th, New York ratifies, 89-79, the 11th state. Requested 33 alterations. Well, the Congress of the Confederation now meets in New York City, and on September 13th, they certify that the new Constitution has been duly ratified. And so they set a date for meeting, convening a new government and holding a presidential election. I believe it's going to be, the meeting will be the next year, and that basically they close, I guess they adjourn. And that's the end of the old government is basically closed. And the date they set for the presidential election was December 15th, and that was the first presidential election. And that brings 1788 to a close. So let's go to 1789 now here. February 4th, the Electoral College convenes, and Washington is elected the president and Adams the vice president. And remember the way they did it back in the first election was everybody votes for 2 candidates, and whoever gets the majority becomes president, and the second largest is vice president. So that was Adams. So now you have Washington Adams as president, vice president. Now on March 4th, the first U.S. Congress convenes at Federal Hall in New York City. And I'll show you what Federal Hall looks like here. This is Federal Hall in New York City. And so they've convened there on March 4th. And a couple of weeks later, they hold their first quorum. And what they do is they elect John Langdon of New Hampshire to be the president pro tempore. And remember, that's the temporary president of the Senate when you don't have a regular Senate. And the electoral votes were counted, and by the president pro tempore, John Langdon. So there's John Langdon. So he's elected the president pro tempore. He's the guy that counted the votes that put Washington as the first president. And the other guy, too, I should mention here, the April 1st, I think that I mentioned this already, the House had the first quorum, and they elected this guy, Frederick Muhlenberg, as the first speaker. Anyway, on April 6th, they counted the votes and they certified as president, vice president. On April 21st, John Adams, and again, here's John Adams, he's sworn in as the vice president, and now he takes his position as president of the Senate. And then on April 30th, George Washington is sworn in, and he takes his position as the President of the United States. And of course, they're all in New York at this time. Now, in the meantime, James Madison, and here's James Madison, he was busy, he was getting all these requested alterations to the Constitution and keeping track of them. And he was writing up, trying to combine them and getting them whittled down to a reasonable number. I think he got it down to like about 19 amendments to the Constitution. And finally, on September 25th, the Congress voted, and they selected 12 constitutional amendments that they were proposing. So the Congress had passed these now. Remember, they have to pass them by 2/3 of both houses. So 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate both voted on September 25th. They had to pass these things. And the next step was to send them off to the states for ratification. Remember, 3/4 of the states will have to ratify them. Okay, I won't mention, a lot of stuff was going on behind the scenes here. It's be a class in itself, but guys like Alexander Hamilton were writing a bunch of documents. There were basically two camps. There were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Alexander Hamilton was like one of the Federalists. Pretty sure James Madison was a Federalist too. And there was other people on the other side. I don't have pictures of them here, but like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson were Anti-Federalists. And so just continue on. A couple of more states ratified. November 21st, North Carolina ratifies. And they requested alterations also. And on May 29th, finally, in the next year, this is 1790, Rhode Island finally ratifies, becomes the 13th state to ratify. And so it took a long time. But let me just go back to September 25th, the 12 constitutional amendments. That became, well, here they are here. They wrote up these 12 amendments, and that's what we're going to talk about next here is the first proposed 12 amendments to the Constitution. And but one other thing I'll mention, there was 13 states. On January 10th, 1791, the state of Vermont, actually it was Vermont, was actually, they ratified the Constitution, and they applied to join the Union as the 14th state. And I'll just show you this map here. And you can see Vermont, before then, was not a state. And you might find this interesting and surprising, but before Vermont became a state, it was actually a sovereign country. There was actually its own nation of Vermont up there. And you can also see in this map here that Massachusetts, Maine was not a state, it was part of Massachusetts. But you can see that the very first state was Delaware, December 7th, 1787. The very last one was Rhode Island, May 29th, 1790. And New Hampshire on June 21st, 1788, became the number 9 ratifying state, which made it the official constitution. And that was the beginning of our constitutional government. So that's basically the story of the Constitution being ratified. And so the next step is we're going to look at the 12 proposed amendments to the Constitution. And that's the next episode.